think we may as well start. So if I could just say welcome to everybody to the first in the new series of Geary seminars. As you can see, we've decided to go online for very, very obvious reasons. We're still learning how to Zoom and make it work for people, so please bear with us. And today, our first seminar is the launch of the Irish report on the European Social Survey round 9, which was conducted in 2018 and 19. And so the way we're running it today is that Rosemary Sweeney from the IRC, which has been our valued supporter throughout the process, is going to say a few words. Then I'm going to introduce the survey, followed by Matt Creighton and then Micheál Collins, presenting the key results of the survey in 2018-19. So Rosemary, over to you. Oh, before you start, I should say, we are more than happy to accept questions. And the way it works on webinar is at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A function. So if you submit your questions, just write them into the Q&A function and we'll deal with them at the end of the seminar. Okay, Rosemary, over to you.
Great, thanks, Philip. Hello, everybody, and yeah, just happy to be here joining you virtually for this launch of the European Social Survey top-line results of round 9. So as Philip said, I'm Rose Sweeney. I manage a range of the European research programmes, including the European Social Survey for the Irish Research Council. I also sit as a member of the General Assembly for the European Social Survey over the last year. So it's wonderful to mark the launch of this report on Irish social attitudes for 2018 and 19 of the round 9. So I look forward today to hearing from the team here joined with us this afternoon, highlighting the new findings and data for this important work. It's a good opportunity to reflect together on the valuable insights that the European Social Survey have brought us. As many of you will know, the European Social Survey originates back to 2001, combining 24 member states, and there's always new guests coming in, observing, and there's definitely growth there in the European Social Survey of people interested in joining. So this scale is impressive, and it's still the highest number of members of any European research infrastructure consortium at the moment, which is pretty impressive. And Ireland, as a founding member, has participated in every round of the ESS to date, and us ourselves here at the IRC, through the ESF or I roadmap back in the day, we identified that the European Social Survey as a key infrastructure project for the social sciences in Ireland. We funded the Irish participation in the survey as a result of this. IRC, we are strongly committed to Ireland's participation in this survey. We value the role in measuring important patterns in Europe using the highest methodological standards and in offering the data that is comparable across the different countries and times. It also provides an excellent opportunity for young researchers to acquire and develop skills and key skill sets of research and participation through such a large scale survey. So that's something we really value in supporting this work. The European Social Survey is designed primarily for the academic research community, and in turn, your wonderful analysis of this data is an immense use for Irish policymakers in meeting societal needs. And the contribution of this research to wider society cannot be overstated. This research is always necessary and always required, but never so much as in today's time of a global pandemic is it more as so relevant to have these attitudes gathered and this wonderful data. So we're delighted that the team of researchers here today in the Geary Institute were appointed as the national coordinators for round 9. And also for round 10, which I know they're working away on at the moment. So on behalf of the Irish Research Council, I'd like to take this time to congratulate the team here, led by Professor Philip O'Connell, on producing such essential research and data for Ireland.
That's great. Thanks, Rosemary, for those very supportive words. And from our side, I'd have to register that we are very appreciative of the long-term support of IRC for this, what we think is a really important project. So my next thing to do is to share my screen, and hopefully that should bring it live. Okay, so this is actually the first time that the ESS results have been reported in an Irish context. So we discovered when we got involved in the project that it hadn't been the practice to issue a report on the Irish findings. So we thought that was a bit of an opportunity missed, because there's a lot of effort goes into this, and it's useful to reflect back to the Irish public, but also reflect forward to academics and policymakers as to what it is that we found in the Irish survey. So just to recap, and Rosemary's already mentioned many of these features. So the European Social Survey is an academically driven cross-national comparative survey with a very strong emphasis on the comparative dimension. So it's very tightly controlled to make sure that the same questions are asked in the same way in each country. It's a survey of attitudes, beliefs, and behavior patterns, and it surveys all residents aged over 15 in private households without a top age cap. It's conducted every 2 years since 2001, and so that means that there are now 9 waves of the data, and it's been conducted in more than 30 countries, with various countries dropping in and out from year to year. Ireland is one of the countries that's participated in each of the 9 rounds with support from the Irish Research Council, and that means then that we are able to look back effectively over the best part of 2 decades to trace the changes in attitudes, beliefs, and behavior patterns over time, and then to compare them with what's happening in other countries. Round 10 is due for field work. We should be in the fields this month, but as everybody will understand, we're not. We've deferred it until conditions improve for conducting face-to-face research in people's houses. The ESS 9 in Ireland was conducted between November 2018 and April 2019 by Behavior and Attitudes, and I would have to say that they did a really professional, excellent job of collecting the data. It was a random probability sample of households, and then within households there was random selection of the respondent using the first birthday method, or the nearest birthday method, I should say. And so we conducted, or Behavior and Attitudes conducted, face-to-face interviews of 2,217 individuals. The response rate was 62%, which is a very good response rate in ESS terms. It puts us in the top 10 in European terms in terms of the response rate. Just to mention the Irish ESS coordinator team, the PIs are myself, Micheál Collins, and Mathew Creighton. The de facto coordinator was Daniel Capistrano, who looked after all of the details and ensured that the survey got done. Daniel's moved on to greater things now at the UCD School of Education. And the project manager making sure that everything happened was Susan Butler, who's also the Institute research manager. So I'm going to start by talking about a few of the key issues that we came across in our data, and then I'm going to pass on to Matt Creighton. So the first up was trust in institutions, and here we're looking at a scale which ranges from, it's an 11-point scale which runs from 0, no trust at all, to 10, complete trust in an institution. And we decided to cut it at 0 to 4 would be low trust, and from 6 to 10 would be high levels of trust. And what we discover is that Irish people have pretty high levels of trust in police and in the legal system. About 2/3 of people have trust in the police, but there are much lower levels of trust in politicians and Parliament. So about 55% have lower levels of trust in political parties and in politicians, and just over a quarter have high levels of trust in those important institutions. This, of course, varies over time, and we're able to look back in time with the previous rounds of the ESS. And what we find is that while trust in the guards and in the legal system are pretty high and have been stable across time, trust in politicians and political parties pretty much tracks the economic cycle. And what that means is that trust was pretty high in politicians up to about 2006. And then it took a nosedive during the period of the Great Recession. And it has been recovering in more recent years with the economic recovery. It's also the case that trust tends to be related to education. And levels of trust are greater among those with higher levels of education. But we can also see that levels of trust, which are low among politicians, is pretty pervasive across all levels of education. Second set of issues we wanted to look at was the perception of Irish people in the European Union. And here we have three questions that are of interest. One is trust in the EU Parliament. Another one is the attitude to European unification or integration. And the third is the sense of emotional attachment to Europe. And just to summarize the results there, Irish residents have actually quite a good deal of trust in the European Parliament. And in fact, the levels of trust expressed there are somewhat higher than we found for trust in the Dáil in the previous slides. About 31% are not in favor of any further EU integration or unification, but somewhat more, 41%, are actually in favor of further integration within Europe. And in terms of emotional attachment, there seems to be widespread and very high levels of emotional attachment to Europe among our sample of Irish people. Again, we find interesting variation over time, so that trust in the EU Parliament, which was quite high in the early part of this century, declined very substantially around 2010, around the time that the EU, ECB, IMF Troika were dictating policy in Ireland. But again, they've recovered, although not quite to the same level as they would have been before the Great Recession. Now, in each of the surveys, the coordinators in each country are allowed to add a few specific country questions. And one of the sets of questions that we asked related to attitudes to Irish unity among Irish residents. And so here are a couple of questions that we asked. The first question was, do you think the long-term policy for Northern Ireland should be to remain part of the UK with direct rule, with devolved government, or to reunify with the rest of Ireland? The pattern of results, this is back in 2018-19, about in relation to long-term policy, is about 46% of Irish residents opted for or are in favor of Irish unity. But then again, many refused or did not know refused to answer the question or did not know. If we exclude those, which is a fairly normal kind of thing to do, about 54% of people in Ireland are in favor of Irish unity. And then the second question we asked is in relation to a potential referendum. And so the question is, how would you vote in a referendum on whether Northern Ireland should leave the UK and unite with the Republic of Ireland? And so the options were to vote for Northern Ireland to remain part of the UK, 22%, vote for Northern Ireland to unite with the Republic of Ireland, 53%. However, a great number of people either refused, 13%, or said they wouldn't vote, another 12%. If we were to exclude the non-voters from this response, we would find that 60% would vote for unification. And if we excluded both the non-voters and the refusals from the question, the majority in favor of unity would be over 70%, which is quite a large number. If we just look again at variation by levels of education, we can see that there's not a great deal of variation in terms of voting preferences by level of education, but there is significant variation between levels of education in terms of people's attitude to policy to unify with Northern Ireland. The higher the level of education, the less people are inclined to opt for a policy to unite with Ireland. So that's my lot. I'm going to pass on to Matt now to talk initially about findings in relation to trust. Matt, over to you.
Okay, so I have to trust you to advance the slide, I suppose.
Just tell me when.
When? So here's trust, and this is kind of a question that gets at broad senses of how people perceive others within Ireland. And the question kind of gets at, in a very, very general sense, whether or not you have a sense of trust for others, or whether you consider there to be kind of a level of mutual suspicion. These are averages on an 11-point scale. So higher values are relatively higher amounts of trust. And you can look at them across time. And the interesting thing you'll see for a few other measures we have in here across time, this is a pretty significant amount of variation for an ESS measure over time, meaning that it's quite variable, the level of trust people perceive in each other, and it declines quite significantly. And the years aren't, they don't perfectly track on any particular economic crisis, but certainly 2006 to 2014 would be a relative low point, with some evidence perhaps that you're going up afterwards. But that level of variation is somewhat interesting. But if we can look at the next slide, when a lot of the action for that trend over time is actually captured by the most educated. And if you look at the vocational, upper secondary, lower secondary, and less than lower secondary, the higher levels of trust always is greater, and significantly so, than lower levels of trust. But the tertiary education, so those that have entered into a university setting or beyond secondary school, are where you get notably higher levels of trust and lower levels of what falls into the you can't be too careful, we're dealing with others, is the wording of the ESS. And that's actually where a lot of the variation is over time as well, in that high level of trust. All right, so that's kind of it. Trust is a nice metric to understand a society. It has a lot to do with social solidarity and sense of belonging. It also maps onto well to other outgroup measures like attitudes towards immigrants, and general levels of trust are also intimately related. The next thing we're going to look at is health. So, and healthcare systems. The first slide is actually flipped, which is a mistake of mine, but the higher value at the top is actually very good health, fortunately. And the lower trend is fair, bad, or very bad health. And that'll be in the next slide, you'll see that that's also the case. So this is an example of a metric. This is just the percentages rather than some sort of average, but you don't have as much action of this over time, which is, we're grateful that you don't see some sort of, lifting off of people who are in very bad health. There is some variation there among the percentage points, but there's not actually too much tremendous variation across time. I just marked the points that are the highest and lowest for each of the two metrics, but relatively consistent over time. And in general, relative to other countries, those that report very good health in Ireland is on the higher end. So there are more people more pleased with themselves, but in general, Ireland does fairly well. So the next slide looks at these same percentages, but now looking at employment status and levels of education again. This is a widely known stratification process that does with self-reported health, in which those that have lower levels of education or in relatively unfortunate or disadvantaged economic circumstances tend to report significantly higher levels of bad health, and good health very tightly maps onto higher levels of education, which is a proxy for many things. It's not just that, like, because you took my class in sociology, you're all of a sudden feel better about everything. It has more to do with how that gives you access to a variety of different aspects of Irish society. So that's the education measure, and that's a pretty standard gradient. So higher levels of education, higher proportion of the population reports good health. Okay. The next thing we're going to look at is the by income decile, and this is the percent in good health. You have this is a fairly common gradient for those that look in other contexts as well, is where you have this very notable improvement as you go up the income distribution, and then some evidence, it kind of flattens, and then there's even some evidence of a diminishing point of return. So I guess you can do well, but just don't do too well if you want to have good health, would be the idea for the income. And that's a fairly typical pattern, is at the very, very top of the income decile, you see either a stability or even sometimes a decline in terms of reported very good health. All right, we can go to the next one. This is also poor spelling on my part, but this is satisfaction with the healthcare system, and it's kind of overlaid with that measure of very good health in terms of percentage. And this is looking at the age gradient. And the reason people might want to look at the age gradient for satisfaction with healthcare system is that you would want to know points at which the healthcare usage is relatively higher. So people have greater interaction with the healthcare system as the age distribution goes up. And to know something about how they might perceive that is somewhat interesting. And you do see this kind of taking off of satisfaction with the healthcare system, which is a relatively positive pattern if you think about it, because at stages of life in which you might interact with the healthcare system more significantly, so you wouldn't want to necessarily see a decline with satisfaction in that same system, although you do see a decline in self-reported health, which is also a standard pattern as the years go by, which I'm experiencing myself. All right, so we can continue on. These are the kind of the science of happiness. So this is general happiness and general health. So the percentage in good health or good and very good health and the percentage happy. And they map pretty well together. So a lot of people actually use these measures somewhat interchangeably if they're looking at some sort of broad outcome to think about happiness and good health as being somewhat interchangeable. It would be strange, I suppose, if you had very good health and you're miserable. So that does make sense that you would have that going on. So we can advance it again. So we'll look at immigration. Immigration is an interesting pattern. We'll look at a couple dimensions here, but we'll start out. So you flip one more. Basically, the ESS has a couple measures of immigration, but the ESS tries to disentangle, with limited success, but it's a good effort, economic, cultural, and general kind of co-residence or just broad notions of immigration, the impact of immigration on a context. And so they ask questions about the role of the impact of immigration on the economy, culture, and place to live, and higher values is a relatively more positive view. And you see a significant amount of variation in this over time. These are average values again. And for similar years, really, as what we saw before, a decline and then a pretty notable recovery, in fact, exceeding in some of the highest values reported on average, perception of immigration on the economy, culture, and life in more recent years. So can we go to the next one? These are just looking at those same three measures and the percentage who positively view immigration, looking at employment status, broad categories of employment status, which is just in paid work or unemployed. And you have in some contexts, this is a chasm between the two, but this is a relatively tight distribution as it goes, in that those that are in paid work and those that are unemployed are different in that the unemployed tend to have a more negative view of the impact of immigration on all domains. But the gap isn't necessarily that large, and particularly when it's outside of a broad general category or just an economic measure can be somewhat closer together. That would be the cultural measure in the middle. But it's still the dominant position, with the exception of the economy, for those unemployed, is that a relatively positive view. Okay. This is the same three measures and looking across the education gradient, and there isn't too much to see here, honestly, except for the standard gradient across all dimensions, but you don't see a lot of variation by levels of education in that there's a more positive view in terms of culture versus the economy. It's relatively consistent, and people have pointed out and even critique these measures as kind of being redundant in some ways because people don't make really, really bright distinctions necessarily between economic and cultural aspects of immigration. So we can go on. I think that's you, Micheál. Yeah?
Yeah, it is. Thanks, Matt. So on to me, and I'm going to pick up on three further areas that we have captured in the ESS and that are reflected in the report that we're publishing today with the summary measures accompanying the seminar. So the first of those on satisfaction, onto the next slide, Philip, and the first measure that we have here is one of life satisfaction. Simply, the survey asks people, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole nowadays? And so one of the things we wanted to do in this report was not just present the results from the latest round, but also sit them into the context, as you'll have seen, of the results from all the earlier rounds back along in Ireland. So the red line there is giving you life satisfaction, which relative to other European countries, it's the same question asked in the same way in other countries, so we can compare it to others. We're not doing that in this report. We're purely focusing on Ireland and Ireland over time. But that's quite high, and it's remained high over time. It's stabilized since the ESS round back in 2016. And of course, as you'll see too, tied to the economic cycle as well. So a notable dip in life satisfaction alongside the Great Recession just over a decade ago, and recovering since then. We mapped in the happiness variable as well. They're showing a similar pattern over time as well. That was a 0 to 10 scale. You can move on, Philip, to the next slide, which is a related indicator in the report on economic satisfaction. So how satisfied are you with the present state of the economy? This sort of rather nicely maps that cycle of boom, bust and recovery that Ireland's gone through right across that whole period of the European Social Survey. So a recovery in that indicator up to 2018 from very low points, as you would have expected back in the ESS rounds in 2008, 10 and 12. So nice indicator capturing that as well. And you can move on, Philip. We look in the report at that indicator just in terms of the data for 2018. So this is disaggregated by age group. As some of you will be aware, the ESS, on top of all of these indicators, has a range of socioeconomic variables in there, so you can decompose the results in different ways. So that's the figure looking at those who indicate that they are satisfied with the present state of the economy, and then how they divide across the age groups. So satisfaction highest for those, I suppose, well into their retirement, declining on the way up to retirement, and then beginning to increase after that. And you can move on, Philip, to the next category, which sort of pulls two indicators in together under an umbrella of precarity. So you can go on, Philip, to the first of those, which is one of the country-specific questions we got to put into this report, and it looks at the proportion of workers who perceive their current job as secure. And that question was asked in the ESS in 2004 and in 2010. So we added it in as a question to be asked in 2018, in a sense to be able to try and capture people's perceptions or workers' perceptions of precarity across the economic cycle. So in a sense, from boom in 04 to bust in 2010 and back up to recovery in 2018. The results then, not particularly surprising, they are as you'd expect. I suppose the 2018 picture is very similar to what existed prior to the economic crash, and then you get that big increase in precarity for 2010, and now I know there's working on some research to sort of delve into that a bit more detail, which I'm sure you'll see in the months to come. If you look within that indicator, and we mentioned it in the report, job security is, as you'd expect, strongest towards the top of the income distribution. And you can go on to the next slide, Philip, which then looks at a sort of another metric that maybe touches on that precarity issue, which is the perception that households have of their current income. So it asks them whether they are finding, whether they're living life comfortably, whether they're coping, whether they're finding it difficult, or whether they're finding it very difficult. As you look at it on the right-hand side, the summary measure, overall 40% of households living comfortably, 45% coping, about 1 in 8, so 12% finding it difficult, and 3% finding it very difficult. But then the graph decomposes that down across the income quintiles, so you can see, as you would expect, the levels of coping and difficulty increase as you go down the income distribution. So again, an interesting insight from respondents to the survey, and we've weighted these up to be then representative of the population, but an insight into their experiences and perceptions of life as well. And then Philip, onto the last category, which is religion, and you can go on to the indicator on the next slide, which is one of these long-standing European Social Survey questions. And so it asks about if individuals belong to a particular religion. And that shows a steady decline really over the last decade in that figure. So the comparing the latest ESS, 68%, a decline from 72% in 2016, and that reflects a declining proportion of religiosity over time as well. Of the 68% articulating that they belong to a particular religion, most 90% are, as you would expect, belonging to Roman Catholicism. And then if you decompose, as we do in the report, religious belief strongest among females, among those with lowest completed education levels, and among those living in rural locations. And then across the age groups, religion or religiosity increases with age, and it's only those who are age 56 and above who are displaying a greater proportion of religious belonging than is the case on average for the population as a whole. And you can go on, Philip, again. That sort of brings us to the end of where we want to go with this. I suppose the intention of this seminar was to just flag for you, as those interested in this survey, what the sort of headline results are. They're very much the headline results because, of course, the beauty of the ESS is that it gives you the potential, enormous potential, to dig further into that data and use it in a much more interesting way, or a much more detailed way, rather. What the ESS is doing is, uniquely providing that representative portrait of Ireland and Irish behaviours and attitudes over time. And of course, we can do it not just Ireland over time, as we are doing in this report, but also comparatively to other European countries as well. It's the great strength of the data set, and the great strength that Ireland has been in it consistently from the word go. We have placed the report for this accompanying this presentation, and I suppose as the end point for our work on this survey, up on the Geary website. So if you follow that link, you will be able to get it, and it'll be we'll tweet it out on the ESS Twitter later on as well. A reminder too that the intention here, reflecting what Rosemary said at the very start, is that this whets your appetite either as researchers to use this data, as policymakers or policy designers or policy analysts in various ways to draw on this data. And all of the data is available in an enormously user-friendly way on the ESS website. That's the web address there, europeansocialsurvey.org. Very straightforward process for using the data, and we, like the IRC and everybody else, really anxious that people use the data, hence this report and hence our presentation as well. And then, as Philip mentioned at the very start, preparations already well underway for ESS 10. It's delayed clearly because of the current challenges. But also picking up on those current challenges, we have also across all the ESS participant states designed a special module which will be in the field, picking up on people's attitudes to and experiences of COVID-19 as well. So will lead to some interesting representative samples and social perceptions from that as well. And I'll finish there, Philip.
That's great. Thanks, Matt and Micheál. I think we have some questions, and I have to go looking for them. Okay. So the first question from Kevin Denny is whether we looked at male-female differences in trust. So,
I pulled up the report. Does it help, Philip? We haven't. We've only presented the headline figures in the report. So we tried to make this a very short report that people might have a look through and browse and get a feel for the data that's in there. So therefore, we didn't engage in every possible decomposition of every indicator. So in fact, that isn't broken down by trust. But if Kevin wants to do that, it's a really simple process on the ESS data set to do that. And indeed, I suppose his question illustrates the very point that there are so many angles and perspectives you can take on every single one of these indicators, given the quality of the data and the range of socioeconomic variables that are there that will allow you to break down on it. So no, Kevin, but we'd encourage you and others to go off and answer those really interesting questions.
Okie doke. Thanks, Micheál. There was a question about COVID, but I think Micheál actually answered it at the very end of the presentation there. There is a module on COVID planned for ESS 10. And question from Dorothy Watson. Hi, Dorothy. She says, thanks for a very interesting presentation. Congratulations on the initiative of presenting the key findings for Ireland. And then she asks the tough question, given that the census has been postponed, what do you think the chances are that fieldwork will be possible in 2021? Or what would need to happen to make you confident to go ahead? That's a really good question. So we've been back and forth with the rest of the ESS 9 team on how to proceed. As you know, we've deferred and delayed. We're waiting until later next year to see how we might proceed. And we're consulting with everybody that we can to try and figure out who's doing face-to-face interviews and how they're doing it. I've been talking to people in the CSO just within the last day or so, and discovered that they're engaged in all sorts of interesting innovations, including computer-assisted and web interviews and so on. So I mean, we'll just have to wait and see. One of the big issues for us is that our sample is identified as a household, and then within the household you have to identify an individual at random, and so we have to knock on the door and then find somebody who is not going to volunteer, but who's actually going to be identified as the response person, and then you have to interview them. And the ESS runs for 45 to an hour long interview, so that's quite a challenge. And so we'll have to look very carefully at whether it's at all feasible. But that would be a decision that we would take in the middle of next year. I don't know whether Matt or Micheál, as the responsible co-PIs, want to add anything to that.
The only thing to add is that we're not alone. So that all the other countries who are doing ESS are also confronting significantly degraded landscapes for doing face-to-face interviews. So there is a kind of a collaborative aspect to it too. In other words, we are getting input from other field teams, and over time, hopefully some will enter the field and also bring some of those experiences with them. I looked up trust by gender, by the way, and the difference is 3% overall and not significant.
And Philip, I'll just add in too, I suppose, one of the interesting experiences being that all of our colleagues on the ESS 10 are determined that it continue to be a fieldwork survey where people are in a traditional way calling to houses and collecting the data in that way. So that's that of course means it's a challenge to do it for ESS 10. Hence the delay, but it's something we'd hope to be able to fulfill over the next while, and obviously keep that comparability then at a European level.
There's another very interesting question. Do you expect that the COVID-19 pandemic would increase or decrease confidence in politicians? Which is a really very interesting question, and I think the answer is likely to be it kind of depends on how things pan out over the next 6 months or so. My sense would have been that in the early stages of the pandemic there was an increase in support for serving politicians or politicians in government. Whether that continues, I think, very much depends on how the crisis is handled and how people perceive that to be handled. So I think it's very much up for grabs. Any other reflections on that one?
Philip, I'll just add in there. I mean, one of the beauties of this survey is that when we get to the next round, you know, it will ask, there is that COVID-19 module, and it will capture a lot of issues in there. And of course, it would be comparable between countries. And as we know, different governments and different countries have handled this crisis so far in different ways. And, you know, clearly the overall picture will reveal itself over time. So I would have thought that's a really interesting question. And I would have thought there's an enormous amount of social research that will derive from that, and we'd hope certainly that the next round of the ESS will be fairly crucial in being able to benchmark how people respond and people's attitudes towards that crisis within and comparatively across countries as well.
There is also an aspect that COVID-19 has questions about perception of EU institutions as well, not just national governments, but also the EU response is asked in detail.
Okay, a couple of more questions coming in. One is about levels of trust in media, noting that levels of trust in media are very high in Ireland. And I'm wondering whether this survey asked a question about trust in media. I don't remember. Do either of you guys?
I don't think the trust question itself included media as one of the breakout categories. I'm trying to remember back. I can't remember easily. If you gave me 10 minutes in the computer, you could find it or less, you'd find it very easily on the ESS website. There may have been specific questions around the media in previous ESS components back along that you could draw on. Okay.
And Dave Madden has a question about Brexit, whether there was any questions asked on Brexit. And again, this would have had to have been something that would have been in the Irish only questionnaire, and we didn't ask that question. We were more interested in the questions about Irish unity and precarity rather than Brexit. So maybe that's a missed opportunity. And that brings us to the end of the questions. So unless anybody has any other burning issues, I think it's for me to thank everybody for their attention. Thank you again, Rosemary, for coming to offer your support from the IRC, and thanks to my my co-authors and co-PIs. And thank you for listening. So with that, we close the seminar, and thank you for attending. Take care now.
Thanks, everybody.